Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squad for boxing news and views from around the internet. Significant movement in the WBA rankings this month, with Luis Ortiz returning to the good graces of the organisation, entering at a high spot within the list. Also, a couple of fighters dropped from last month. We have Agit Kabayel entering at a relatively high spot given his recent inactivity. And I'll start with something that's above the rankings but connected to it. If you see here on screen, so above the top 15 there is always who holds the WBA heavyweight titles. At the moment you have 3 champions plus the interim champion Trevor Bryan. Bryan occupies top spot, but this isn't about him. It's about the WBA gold champion. See here on screen, that was Joe Joyce. But from last month to this month, at some point, at least according to this latest update, Joe Joyce has vacated that title. So because he held that gold title and was considered a champion, he was above the rankings, but he's not in this top 15, and apparently he does not have the belt anymore. So I've approached Sam Jones, Joe Joyce's manager, to get a bit of a comment on what's gone on here, because obviously dropping a belt and we're really none the wiser about what's happened. Is this a mistake? Well, I guess we'll soon find out. But starting at the top, so Trevor Bryan, the interim champ, maintains his place at number 1. Number 2 through 4 are the same: Alexander Usyk, Anthony Joshua, Adam Kovnatski. 1 to 4 is the same as last month. But the big news this month comes at number 5 with the inclusion of Luis Ortiz at 5th in the ranking. So he enters at a very high spot, and this is coming off a loss to Deontay Wilder. He was fighting for the WBC title, lost that one, but enters at number 5. And what makes this all the more stranger is Luis Ortiz has been out of the WBA rankings for a couple of years. And what led to that? Well, at least for a year period, he was not eligible to be in the rankings because of a failed performance-enhancing drug test. That was from September 2017. He was going to be fighting Deontay Wilder in November of that year, failed the test, hadn't filed some paperwork for blood pressure medicine. Well, that was the story that he gave. The WBA did not believe him, whereas the WBC did. So he ultimately got cleared by the WBC, had his title shot in March 2018 against Wilder the first time, but the WBA said no. You're going to be out of our rankings for a year, and he would have had to provide some test results to prove that he actually was a clean fighter, because it wasn't the first time he'd failed a performance-enhancing drug test. Back in, 2014 or 2015, facing Latif Kiyodi, after that fight, he failed a test. So Ortiz, after 2 years out of the WBA rankings, back in the organization's good graces, he is at number 5. It is a real surprise to me, but the thing to consider here is Luis Ortiz now number 5. You have a vacant title apparently. You also have a top-ranked fighter in Agit Kabayel entering the rankings, and we'll get to that later. So Kabayel and Ortiz parachuted into the ranking. PBC and Top Rank looking to do an event in February 2020 for Wilder and Fury. So you can join some breadcrumbs here and go, is Luis Ortiz being teed up to face Agit Kabayel? It's an interesting question, and the prospect of that fight, not a bad one, but it does sort of appear that, they've been parachuted in here for some reason. What that quite is, if it is to fight for that gold title, well, it's going to come out in the wash pretty quickly. But Ortiz, after 2 years out, in at number 5. Alexander Povetkin is at 6, Michael Hunter at number 7. These two will be fighting on December 7th. That is an eliminator within the WBA, and you can see here to the right of their names, they do have minor belts within the WBA, the Intercontinental title and the International title by the look of it there. And just to note with those two guys, so because of the inclusion of Luis Ortiz, Povetkin and Hunter have moved down 1 spot in this month's rankings. And that's also the same with Derek Chisora. He's at number 8, and at number 9 is Filip Hrgovic. He's down 1 as well. But what's interesting, previously at 9th spot, which was a month ago, was Otto Wallin, and he is out of the WBA rankings altogether. So he's been dropped like a cold potato off a cliff here, and not in the top 15 at all, which is relatively surprising given that, the WBA tends to hang on to fighters that are sort of in their mid rankings for quite some considerable time. So to be dropped altogether, having been 9th, little surprising, but it's the WBA after all. At number 10, another surprise inclusion in the WBA top 15. Agit Kabayel at 10th spot. He's been relatively inactive in the past couple of years. Just the one fight in 2019, that was a win against Andrei Rudenko. So he hasn't had any activity in recent months, but seemingly the WBA has decided that's good enough to get him in to 10th spot. So maybe a Kabayel and Ortiz fight does have some legs, and I like it. That would be a good one. And that would be a much more competitive fight than a lot of people would probably give Kabayel credit for. He had a very good win over Derek Chisora back in 2017, and since then he's stagnated somewhat, but he's now on a co-promotional deal with ESPN and Top Rank. They've publicly stated they're looking to get him out in early 2020. And an Ortiz fight, yeah, well, that would certainly be a welcome to Top Rank, and if it was on a Wilder and Fury undercard, it's a big scene for Kabayel and Ortiz to contest for possibly a vacant gold title. We'll have to see what happens, but whatever has been happening, there's been lobbying behind the scenes going on. These two guys parachuted into the rankings. For what purpose? Unclear at this point. We can obviously speculate, but maybe, these guys are being lined up for other fights potentially. Remember, you've got Manuel Cha, WBA regular title, and also Trevor Bryan, who is the interim champion. Ortiz and Kabayel fighting for one of those titles. It could actually have some legs too, potentially. Certainly Trevor Bryan and Manuel Cha, they need a fight. Remember, Manuel Cha picked up his title against Alexander Ustinov 2 years ago in the end of 2017. November of that year, hasn't fought since. Trevor Bryan, he won his title mid last year against BJ Flores, hasn't fought since. So someone needs to get in there and give these guys a fight, and perhaps Luis Ortiz is being positioned to have a crack at one of those guys. Stranger things have happened, but I think even at this point in his career, 40 years old, I think he beats Bryan, and I think he also beats Manuel Cha. Manuel Cha is probably the easier of the two fights in my view. At number 11, Christopher Lovejoy, who is the club fighter who largely has campaigned in Tijuana. He is at number 11, so seemingly off the back of limited activity himself, still maintaining a top 15 spot in the WBA. Sergey Kuzmin is at 12. He had to pull out of his scheduled fight with Zhili Zhang, and ultimately Zhang went on to face Andrei Rudenko, beat him. This was this past weekend at the end of November. At 13, Kyotaro Fujimoto. He is at 13, down one spot. He has a fight coming up against Daniel Dubois. And given Daniel Dubois is not in these rankings, the fact that he's probably going to blast out Fujimoto in less than a round, I'd expect probably within the New Year's update to see Daniel Dubois in the rankings. But for now, Kyotaro Fujimoto is keeping 13th spot warm, soon to be decimated by Dubois, no doubt. Mladen Malas is down one spot to 14, and his spot there was occupied by Ivan Doichko, the Kazakh fighter, who was gone altogether. So towards the bottom of the rankings, if you're at 14th, 15th, 13th, etc., if you get nudged out of the rankings, it's not too much of a surprise compared to, say, Otto Wallin, who was at 9th and gone altogether. And at number 15 is Fraser Kendo. He's been languishing down at 15th spot for a few months now, and he is due a title shot. There is some court action with the WBA. He is owed a title shot. He recently went in front of a judge. Don't know the results of that hearing, but for the meantime, he remains at number 15. So obviously he is still, being kept there for the purposes of being available for a title shot. If this had been cleared up in court and his case dismissed, he would have been gone. So clearly Fraser Kendo still has some juice and leverage over the WBA. Well, we would assume so, given he is still there. Otherwise, I think he would be gone altogether. But what do you make of this? Luis Ortiz back in the rankings after 2 years and inserted at number 5. That's a bit of a surprise. Maybe a title shot with a Trevor Bryan or even Manuel Cha is going to be incoming. Agit Kabayel inserted at number 10. Inactive, not fighting, gets to 10th spot. Otto Wallin dumped altogether out of the top 15. And Joe Joyce, apparently no longer the gold champion, vacated the belt by the look of it. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter. Boxing_squared. I'm out.